Hi, welcome. This is the National Support Session for PSYC 5122. Let's go back to the front page. There's nobody joining this National Support Session. We're only expecting 2 students, but I'm going to record it anyway and upload the recording for you guys who haven't been able to get to the session. So your exam is due on Monday, that's the 27th of June, and please just make sure you note that it's due at 9 o'clock. I will send out a reminder to you that your exam is on Monday, but please make sure you submit it before 9 o'clock so that you don't get caught up in the internet traffic that happens with the submission of exams. So this exam is due on Monday the 27th, and it needs to be submitted by 9 o'clock. Okay, so the exam is 40% of your mark. As you know, your 2 assignments made up 25% each, which was 50% of your mark. 40% is your exam and 10% is your ICE tasks. So you've got 21 hours to complete this exam. So at midnight on Sunday night, early hours of Monday morning, your exam will be released. And you've got 21 hours, so that takes you to 9 o'clock on Monday evening. So the exam is 120 marks. It's more than the assignments. It's an extra 20 marks, and it's an open book exam, which means it's a take-home exam, and it'll be available to you through your VC Learn, the same way that you access your assignments. So if you're unsure how to do that, please just pop me an email, and I will send you some instructions on how to do it. So just some guidelines, please, before the examination. This is quite a big section of work. It's quite a few chapters. It's make sure that you focus on the learning units, and we'll just go through the learning units after this slide. Make sure you understand the relevant sections and can apply it. The most important thing is the application, being able to apply the theory that you know to different scenarios. Remember that as it's a take-home exam, it's not just going to be a case of regurgitating the textbook. It is going to be a case of applying the theory that you know to the examples that are given or applying it in your own life, but it will be a lot of focus on the application. So make sure that you're clear on how to do that. I think you've had enough experience that you understand how that works and how to achieve the marks that you need to pass this exam. When you get your exam, remember that you do have enough time. So you've got enough time to read through it and identify what you need to do. You need to look carefully at the mark allocations to make sure you give the right depth of answer and that you allocate enough time for each question. Obviously, the longer mark questions will need more time and probably some research. Make a rough framework of your answers, and because you start each answer on a new page, don't waste time on the questions you find challenging. Rather do the ones that you're more confident in and then go back to the harder ones or the longer ones, however you need to do it. Make sure you number your questions carefully and make sure you answer all the questions. Just double check before you submit that you've answered all the questions. Okay, so the best approach to do this revision and when you work through it is to look at those learning units that are in your module guide. Each learning unit is outlined very clearly what those learning outcomes need to be from the learning units. So I suggest you put all of those learning outcomes down and make sure that you can refer to the right parts in your textbook to attach them to the learning units and so that you understand what they are. So learning unit 1 is on the thinking mind, on thinking, language and intelligence. Now you did cover some of this in your first assignment this semester. We looked at problem solving and solving steps in problems. So I doubt that's going to be covered again. Language and behavior, look at that section because we haven't done that in an assignment, as well as intelligence. I'd focus in on intelligence, make sure you understand what general intelligence is, fluid intelligence, crystallized intelligence, but carefully go through those learning outcomes and make sure you know how to find that relevant information in your textbook so that you don't waste time looking for things. Learning Unit 2 is on the developing mind. And again, we've touched on quite a bit of this in our assignments and our ICE tasks. And it's very much a focus on when, as we move through our stages and ages and stages, we change physically, we change cognitively, and we change in a social and emotional context. And that's what development is. It's moving through those changes in our physical growth, our cognitive growth, and how we grow socially and emotionally. So understand what that means and apply it to be able to apply an example to that. And also understand the role of nature and nurture, which is very important. And then the textbook moves through those different developmental stages, starting from newborns right up to adulthood. So make sure you understand how those are broken down. An example of the last exam paper is a 20-mark question, and it was looking at parenting styles and attachment styles, and it was asking you to try and link those two things together. So the question was for 20 marks to discuss the link between an individual's parenting style and their child's attachment style. So you need to be able to define what attachment styles are, speak about Harlow's monkey possibly, and the 4 different kinds of attachment styles, and then look at those carefully to see how they link to parenting styles. And it's important they want to see the link. So that's an example of a previous question. And that comes from the infancy and childhood section in your material, a 20-mark question. So clearly show those links. So a 20-mark question should be about a page in length, but the important thing is, and it's asking you 2 different things, but it wants you to see you link them together. That's the application. So that's how that could be used in that situation. So again, that's quite straightforward in your textbook. We've covered it in our collab session that I uploaded for you, and you have done some work on this in your previous assignments. There's another example question from the previous paper. It's focusing on adolescence, and it's talking about how teens try different identities. And how they can short circuit the process. So what it's asking you is to discuss, that means you need to explain 2 techniques for prematurely adopting an identity, and it wants examples. So if that question is for 6 marks, you'd break it into the 2 techniques would be 3 marks per technique. And it probably is about 1 mark for discussing what they are, but the key is in the examples in the response. So that would be about adopting an identity of a group of friends, for example, and how your identity could change because you're trying to be like your friends, or whether you are adopting an identity that's already made, for example, from a parent. So that's an example of a previous paper where it's a 6-mark question and how it will be divided into 3 marks each. The personality section, personality and self. So again, that's broken down into 5 different themes with the different learning outcomes. So make sure that you go through those learning outcomes, do it alongside your textbook so you can identify each section of your textbook that is applicable to that learning outcome. Question that from a previous paper, 10-mark question, looking at 2 ways in which personality could be assessed. So that is theme 4, the assessment of personality. And it's not only asking you to discuss the 2 ways, again, it wants you to provide examples. So personality inventories and projective tests are the 2 ways, but you need to describe in those what those are. What is a projective test, for example, what it will tell you about personalities, how they were used, and give an example like the Rorschach test. So 10 marks, that's 5 marks each, so it's about a paragraph each for those 2 answers, and it just shows you how it can be broken down. Another question from a previous paper, it's a 15-mark question, looking at the core traits from the Big 5 personality theory. It's there asking you to identify the 5 core traits, which are there. It's ocean, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. But it also wants you to give an example. So it's really important. So if there's 5 traits and it's 15 marks, that means it's 3 marks for each of those traits. 1 mark would be to explain it, and 2 marks for being able to give a detailed example. So remember, it's a detailed example. And you need to come up with your own example, not an example from the textbook. We want to see that you can actually apply it to your own understanding of what those personality traits are. So within that learning unit, what is personality, to be able to define it, understand the historical approaches, which is psychoanalysis, behaviorism, and humanism, which we've done humanism in our previous assignment. Look at the contemporary theories. Those are our big 5. What are the biological basis for personality? So those in your textbook outline what temperament is, the role of genetics in the development of personality, as well as the impact of brain structure in personality development. Assessing personality, that is your personality tests that we've just discussed. And the self. So an important part of that we haven't really covered anywhere is to look at the various aspects of self. So that's our self-concept, our self-awareness, our self-esteem, our self-regulation. So understand what those 4 ideas are and what the implications of those 4 aspects of self are. And again, look at the differences of culture and social interactions on the interpersonal self. So that looks around within culture, around individualism and around collectivism. So those areas we haven't really had in an assignment, and they could be something that could come up in your exam. So make sure you understand that area of self as part of this module. Okay, learning unit 4, we covered the troubled mind. Now, in the troubled mind, we probably, and based on previous papers, it's very much looking at the troubled mind plus the treatment, which is the next learning unit. And the way they've questioned it in the past is it's focused in on a specific disorder. So the question here is schizophrenia, and I think in a previous paper it was autism. So it would probably focus in on a specific disorder because that is the bulk of this learning unit. So it will give you the disorder and it will ask you to define it, how it's diagnosed. And remember, when we speak about how something is diagnosed in psychology, we look at our DSM manual in the right version, and your diagnosis comes from that manual. It's not something that's come out of thin air. It's very clear how a specific psychological condition is diagnosed. And so take that from your DSM-5 manual and make sure you can cite it correctly, what the causes are. And in many of the disorders, the causes are maybe an interaction between different things. There can be biological cause, an environmental cause, a social cause, and a cognitive learning cause. Not all of them have all the causes, and some of them are an interaction. So make sure you look at the causes. And then the final part is often your treatment. And the treatment comes from the next learning unit. So it's very clearly laid out that if there's a question on schizophrenia in this learning unit, it's about what schizophrenia is, and in the next learning unit there's an element on the treatment of schizophrenia. So it could very well be combining those 2 learning units into one question. So this one that's there is, it's asking for an academic essay, so it's 30 marks. And please remember, with an academic essay, it means that you have to have an introduction, you have to have a conclusion, you have to have good essay structure, which is your paragraphs. So you need to have good style, good grammar, and most importantly, your referencing. So this section is probably going to be covered through a choice on one of those disorders that you would need to do some work on, and you probably have to do some research to give additional sources other than your textbook. And it's an area that it's very easy to pick up if you've copied directly from the textbook. So please try to make sure you can paraphrase well and that you can apply research to these questions. Okay, this particular question asks to use 2 credible sources over and above the prescribed textbook. That means that you'll be given for marks for those 2. So when you look at the mark allocation, there's 10 marks for the symptoms and behavior. Discussion of the quote in reference to this disorder, that's the application. An outline of treatments comes from the next learning unit, your sources, and your essay structure. So make sure that you, for each of those disorders, I can see exactly how it's defined. And I would really say to you, then the reference is to use your DSM-5 as your manual. Let's just move on to the next slide. Okay, so the troubled mind, I've lost myself. Psychological disorders, learning unit 4, troubled mind. So it's again saying to you on the troubled mind, it's saying to you, make sure you understand the definition of what a disorder is. So a disorder is a significant disturbance in your cognition, in emotional regulation, in behavior, in development processes, underlying mental functioning that results in an abnormal behavior. So that's to make sure you understand clearly what a psychological disorder is. And an abnormal behavior is something that's distressing or harmful to yourself or to other people. That's how an abnormal behavior is defined. And your DSM-5, so the example there for schizophrenia is to show you in the DSM-5 that your disorders are diagnosed through either at least one symptom. It must be either 1, 2, or 3. Okay, so they've got to have hallucinations. They've got to have hallucinations or disorganized speech. And then additional symptoms. It's got to be a disturbance for 6 months at least. There's got to be a social or occupational dysfunction for a significant portion of time. So it's just showing you how you can use the DSM-5 criteria for schizophrenia to look at the diagnosis. Healing the troubled mind, that's the second part of it. So we've done the different disorders, and then part of that, the next phase is going to be the treatment. So when we look at healing the troubled mind, the textbook goes through the main approaches to psychological treatment. So make sure you understand those. It's biological, psychological, evidence-based, and clinical. It also looks at the key principles, which is psychoanalysis, humanistic perspectives. We've done some work on humanistic perspectives, so I don't know if it would be examined again, but we haven't really looked at behavioral therapy, cognitive therapy, or the biopsychosocial approach. So make sure you understand those. The biological therapies and treatment, which can be medication, there can be electroconvulsive therapy, psychosurgery, brain stimulation, and neurofeedback. Make sure you know those. And then the disorder, the treatment of the disorders is going back to learn at Unit 4, where we explained the disorders. This is now the focus on the treatment. And the treatment can be psychological treatment. It can be biological treatment. There could be both. So make sure that you can apply the treatments of the different disorders. So that's about how we heal the troubled mind. Understand what the different types of approaches are to treatment, the historical approaches to the treatment, and the biological therapies, as well as the treatment of the specific disorders. Okay, and the final learning unit that I really suggest you spend some time on, because this has not been covered in your assignments at all, is the healthy mind. So the healthy mind deals with stress and coping. It deals with health psychology as well as positive psychology. So you need to understand what stress is, be able to look at the research on the nature of stress and its response in given scenarios, and explain why, according to the cognitive appraisal models, not everybody experiences change, disaster, or hassles, or social relationship stress in the same way. So that looks at what is called the general adaptation syndrome, which is, I would really suggest you understand that quite clearly in your textbook. It's very nicely laid out, and have a good understanding of that, and why people are different in the way that they experience stress. Very much based on personal experiences, how situations are appraised when that stress takes place or the stressor happens. So understand that everybody is different, and why that might be different. It's different due to previous experiences, the current environment they find themselves in, but there's a general perception that not everybody experiences stress in the same way. So be able to describe the role players in the stress response. So how do the biological organs work in terms of the stress response? What is the impact of gender? Socioeconomic status, that is general. People in situations of poverty might experience more stress than people who are not poor. And epigenetics, and that's the genetic response to stress. The effects of stress on health, so that's various symptoms of that. How we cope with stress. We cope with stress through a problem-focused approach, an emotion-focused approach, or a relationship-focused approach. Understand that, and I'll show you now a past question on that. And outline how hardiness might protect an individual from the negative effects of stress. So hardiness is a trait. It's a trait that someone can either be very hardy or not very hardy, but it's their commitment to coping. It's their ability to control their situation that they're in, and it's how they feel about rising to a challenge of something as hardiness. To look at the biopsychosocial model of health, which is important in modern living, that often we treat, there aren't symptoms. We actually try to prevent people from getting sick. And it's about the impact of biology, of the environment, of the social situation on various things in our life. For example, smoking. A lot of that is a cognitive cause, why people choose to smoke when smoking can be so harmful. So it's addressing it not just from a medical perspective when somebody has got sick from smoking, but trying to actually change behavior before that happens, and the impact of those various things on their lives: tobacco use, nutrition, alcohol, exercise, example. And positive psychology is about positive emotions. It's about how we can be happy, how being happy promotes our well-being, ways to be happy and to promote positive well-being, and that also protects us from getting sick. So an example from a previous question is about 15 marks. Discuss the relationship between stress and the immune system. So that link is that stress can be harmful on the immune system, but generally if it's prolonged stress, short terms of stress, short bouts of stress can be beneficial, but obviously it's not as impactful as prolonged stress. And what the impact is that on the immune system, it's very clearly outlined in your textbook. That's 15 marks. Another question example would be, while going out for a jog in your neighborhood, a dog suddenly runs out of a yard, barking and snarling, giving you a run away as fast as you can. That's 8 marks. Discuss the system responsible for your immediate response. Now remember, it's looking at the words immediate response, and it's underlined to help you to the stressor and the process that follows. So you could talk there about the sympathetic division of your autonomic nervous system. That's that fight or flight response. It's initiated with a stress, and that would be your immediate response, and outline what would happen within your autonomic nervous system, specifically the sympathetic division, in terms of responding to that stress. Another question is 10 marks about coping with stress. So we said coping with stress can be problem-focused, emotion-focused, or relationship-focused. So it's asking you to choose any two and discuss with clear examples. So again, that's really important. That's where the marks are, then in the examples, and include examples where they are most frequently used and indicate possible positive and negative forms of each type of coping. So problem focused is a positive form as you confront the problem, and a negative form as you avoid the problem. And you need to give an example for each of those. Okay, so that's how the questions can be asked in that section. So I think that you will be fine. I think that you need to just make sure that you understand each of those learning outcomes and you know where to find them in your textbook, which pieces of the textbook relate to those learning outcomes, and make sure you're clear on the terms and the concepts. Just please also note it's really important because you will be asked to do additional research outside the textbook to know the difference between an article and a journal. Most probably you're going to be asked for journal articles, so make sure you know how to access the library, make sure you know how to access EBSCOhost, make sure you know how to find an academic article. And an academic article is like a research article in a journal. You'll identify it very clearly because it will have an abstract, it'll have an introduction, it'll have the method, the results, the conclusions, and the references. So make sure you choose appropriate articles that are easy to work with. Don't always choose the first one you find. Go through the articles and find one that speaks to what you want to say, but it says it in an easy way that's easy to interpret the information into your question. Don't write something that is irrelevant to the question. Try and find something that integrates well into the question and that it's easy to support what you're saying. So make sure you take time. It's really important to choose your articles correctly. In your last assignment, it asked you for articles no older than 10 years, and in most cases that was not adhered to. There were articles that were chosen that were older than 10 years, so those were marked with a 0 because the question wasn't read properly. So please make sure if it gives you specific guidelines to choosing that journal article, you choose the correct journal articles that are going to enable you to answer the question to the best of your ability. And again, an area where people have trouble, especially when there's marks for it, is make sure you understand how to write an introduction and how to write a conclusion. If you're writing an essay, there are marks for both of those, and it's an easy way to get marks. So the introduction, the example, the way to do it is when it says you best way to do it is when you finish the main body so that you write it at the end. Put it at the beginning, but you have a good understanding of the topic. So basically you need to introduce the subject of the essay with definition of key terms. That's very important. Highlight the major issues and signpost the essay's key arguments. It's very important. It's the first impression of what will follow, and it really does help us with having a good approach to marking the rest of your essay. If there's a nice clear introduction that's well written with defining key terms in it. And the conclusion, a lot of people forget to write the conclusion. It's not something people think about, but really, again, there's marks for that. And it's an important skill to have. The conclusion should summarize the key themes. It's this take-home message. Okay, so decide, especially if you're using research in your essay, use it to summarize how does your research support your argument or what you're saying. Use it as a summary for that to support what you've said. Don't include any new information. Okay, every information is in the body of the essay. Don't include any new information. And if you're unsure of what to write, read the essay question and answer it in one paragraph. So please be clear on how to write good introductions and conclusions to your essays. There are a difference between the two. One is not a repetition of the other. So yeah, that's everything for this collab session, but you are more than welcome to email me with any questions before the assignment or the exam is due on Monday. Any areas you've got difficulty with, please just pop me an email. There is the referencing resources that are all there for you. I really suggest that you make sure you know how to reference, but your assignment, your referencing has been good. I haven't had a problem with your referencing, so I think you guys have got that under control. But just give yourselves enough time. You probably need to allocate sort of 4 hours of that 12. It says, I mean, in theory, you should be able to complete these exams in 2 hours, but you need to allocate at least 4 or 5 hours in your day, especially if you want to do enough research, good research, and apply your research where it's needed. But I do wish you the best of luck, and again, please just email me if there are any questions. I'm going to stop this recording now, and then I will share it for those who were not here. Good luck and have a good evening further.